I think, there we go. After you hear Beth speak this evening, you're just going to want to buy the book anyways, I'm sure of it. So we are excited that each of you are here. I know not everyone got to say who they are and what they do for the EPC, and there's so many amazing faces on this screen. I'm very excited by the diversity of church sizes and geography that's even represented, and different roles in our churches. What you couldn't hear me say earlier, because I'm not as tech savvy as I wish I was, is that if there is a better time to host an evening event, please text me, email me, or email staff, and we can shift what we can. I thought this would be a good way to catch people who maybe go to bed earlier or get exhausted. I also think that ruling elders, they work real jobs and can't pull away in the middle of the day like us teaching elders to just learn more. And so that's why we stuck it at this time. And also because Beth is coming to us from California, and I thought it would be especially cruel to make her train us at 6:30 in the morning. So, but happy to receive your feedback of better times. And we will have different events at different times for that reason as too. So just really quickly, I did want to say what we do have coming up in March, and then I'm going to let Tim share a little bit more about our very special guest speaker, who we're very thankful that she would take time to be with us. On March 21st, mark your calendar, and we'll pick a time. You guys can give me your thoughts, but this speaker is also coming to us from the West Coast, from the state of Washington. Dr. Wendell Moss from the Allender Center of Trauma from the Seattle School of Bible and Psychology is going to come back. He came last year, and it was a big hit. People really appreciated what he did for us. And he's going to help us teaching elders and ruling elders who have gone through the same trauma as the people we serve, kind of help us identify that and find places of rest amongst that, so we can serve the traumatized while we are in the middle of that as well. So that is March 21st. Working out a time. We are looking close at the evening because, again, he's coming to us from Washington, but let me know some suggested times. I think that'll be a good time. And then in April, we're together for Presbytery, and we're going to do a preaching school for our equipage time. And I believe that Dr. Emmett Price from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary is going to come and do that with us. So that's what we got lined up. And with that, I will let us get into our evening. Tim.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Bonnie. And it's a pleasure to have all of you with us online. It's my privilege to introduce Beth Seversen. She and her husband, Mark, have been friends of our family for almost a decade. Both of our families take an annual refuge at a pastor's family camp in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. That's the UP if you're not from Michigan. And I've always been impressed by Beth's energy for Jesus, her insight into people, and her academic preparation. All three of those converge really nicely in her. And this summer in the UP, Beth did a short presentation for a group of pastors on her book, Not Done Yet. And I really benefited from it and wanted to learn more, and I thought it'd be tremendous to share her with you as members of the Presbytery. So I'm excited to see how her energy and insight and academic skills will align to benefit the church. Dr. Seversen received her PhD from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and is the director of the Center for Christian Ministries and Practical Theology at North Park University in Chicago. Previously, she was the denominational Director of Evangelism for the Evangelical Covenant Church, and she's also served as an associate pastor at churches in the suburbs of Kansas City and Milwaukee, a church planter, and in campus ministry. Also of note is that Beth is the president of the Academy for Evangelism in Theological Education and resides in Santa Barbara, California, where her husband is the lead pastor at Montecito Covenant Church. Beth's passion is encouraging churches in reaching and retaining emerging generations. So I want to just ask you to warmly welcome Beth Seversen. Let me open us in a word of prayer for our time together, and then I'm going to hand it over to Beth. Gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you that you sent your Son, who came to seek and save the lost, that told us that leaving the 99 for the sake of the one is the Father's heart. Thank you that you called us and you said that you would make us fishers of men. And Lord, all of these are all part of our missional call as the church. And we want to kindle that fire in our hearts as well as grow in our skills. And I just thank you for Beth and for her gifts and for her research and for all that she's learned from studying churches that are doing it successfully and fruitfully. And we just commit this time to you. We pray that you'll make our hearts ready to learn and grow. And we pray, more importantly, that not only would we receive this information, but that we would seek to put it into practice and to do something substantial and significant in our own context. Thank you for the adaptability of her material. And we just thank you for her presence with us and ask your blessing on our time. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Tim. I'm so delighted to be with all of you. And thank you for having me. And I also just want to say, I just so appreciate the good work that you're all doing. I know how tired our pastors and ministers are at this season of life, when we're almost coming to the end of the 2-year mark with the pandemic. And I know that it's been in many ways discouraging. We've had a lot of challenges, I think some joys, but a lot of challenges, both in the social climate where we serve, as well as dealing with this medically. So just know that I'm your big cheerleader today. And the last thing I want for you to do is to be overwhelmed by anything I share. I imagine some of you are doing some of these practices I will be sharing with you, and I just applaud you. And then I'd also like to say, I'll probably just set the table full and leave it to you to ask the Holy Spirit, is there something here for you and your church? And I always like to be available to people. So if you want to have a conversation afterwards at some point in time, or you want me to meet with you and another staff person or a small group, just know that I'm always available. My hope is that God will use the research that he led me to do among emerging generational people, but really on the churches serving them well, to just further extend his kingdom among that generation. So that lets you know a little bit about my heart and my passions. So if I might, I'm going to share my screen with you. If you'll just be patient for just a moment. Let's see, we'll do that. We'll share, and then I will bring up the PowerPoint. And I will also go to the right view, which we want to show, which is slideshow view. Play from the start. There we go. Okay. And then I kind of need to move you guys, if I might. There we are, just so that I can see my screen too. Great. So we're going to be talking about churches reaching and keeping emerging adults. But before we even do that, I want to, let's advance the slide. I just want to define some terms and talk a little bit about the generations that we are serving. And so first of all, I want to talk about these two terms that we throw out a lot, Generation Z and millennials. So exactly what are we talking about when we say that? And I imagine some of you listening are Gen X, and you might be boomers like I am. But when we talk about generational theory, it is just that. It's a theory about generations, posing that an entire body of individuals that are born or living about the same time, it's usually a 14 to 20 year period, that group in some ways has a sort of peer personality. They've gone through something together that has shaped them in many ways as a cohort or a group. So they've had a unique place in time in history. They have faced some challenges, maybe some social movements, maybe some events. The economy may have reflected in a particular direction in ways that have actually shaped them as a group. And I want to say that generational theory is more informative, it's suggestive than it is prescriptive. There are certainly outliers, and not everyone in a generation is going to be thinking and behaving in exactly the same ways. So here's some dates. I want you to look at those and kind of find yourself. So you can see me up here in the boomers, and then we have Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z, and our new generation that are right now infants to age 6 are Alpha. They're coming up. But I also want to define cuspers. So cuspers would be someone who is born on one end or the other of these years, these generational years that represent a group or cohort. So for example, my daughter was born in 1994, my youngest, and you can see that she is one of the last millennials, 1994, but actually on the information we're looking at, she might be considered Gen Z. So probably more in the millennial range, just depends on who's actually deciding on these years, and I'll mention that in a moment. So because she has two older sisters, in many ways, she thinks and acts like a millennial, but because she's also worked and mentored and lived with many younger people than herself, she in some ways reflects Generation Z. So that's what a cusper is. They're on one edge or the other. Now, I also want to add that, as I mentioned before, there's no one authoritative body that determines when these generations start and when they conclude. And so I just wanted to take Gen Z as an example. Sparks and Honey, they are academic researchers, and they start Gen Z in 1995. If you look at the Pew Research Forum, they start Gen Z a couple years later. And then if we had Barna written down, they would start Gen Z in 1998. So you can see that's a little bit of our problem. And another reason why we call it theory is there's no one specific body of information saying this is when it starts and this is when it ends. But if we go with the academics, Sparks and Honey, with that early date of 1995 being the first year Gen Z was born, you would see that the first group entering college of Generation Z would have been in 2013, and they would have graduated if they went to a four-year school in 2017. So that means today, in 2022, they are between the ages of 7 and 27. Before I talk about a little bit more about what Gen Z are like, I'll just mention to you, I've already told you I kind of fall in that boomer category. So let's talk about how that might have shaped us. So as a boomer, in the early 60s, I would have been a preschooler when JFK died. And just a little bit older than that, kind of an elementary little tyke, watching a black and white TV when I'm watching JFK's brother, Bobby, be assassinated. And I remember seeing that over and over again. And then just a little bit later, Martin Luther King died and was assassinated. Then when I got to middle school, partly because it was an assignment in social studies, but also because I had so many my friends, their siblings who were older than we were, I would be scanning the newspapers daily to see in my county and then in my small town of 2000, it was a small college town, but did any of my friends or my cousins or our friends' siblings die that day in the Vietnam War? So what happened when I got to high school? Well, in high school, I had a reoccurring nightmare. And that nightmare was that it was the middle of the night and our family got up in the night as well as many other families. And we ran from our homes into the woods, into a cinder block building. And we all hid there. And after a while, gas started seeping up under the doors because the Russians were coming. Now, why did I have that reoccurring dream? Because I'm a product of living through the Cold War. So those are a few ways that I've been shaped. So we're going to be coming back to that in a discussion in a moment, but I just kind of want you to be thinking about, as I'm talking about Gen Z, what's impacting Gen Z? And we'll talk a little bit later too, also about what movements, what was the economy like? What were there wars? What happened, since we're all different generations here sharing together, that maybe formed and shaped you in many ways? So let's describe Gen Z for a few minutes. Okay, they are digital natives. We all know that. they've hardly ever been around without their smartphones. They are the most racially diverse cohort that we've ever seen yet. And by 2026, they will be majority non-white. They're the best educated generation yet. Whoops, excuse me. Except what's interrupting that? I'm trying to find COVID. Okay, so let me go back again, and I want to see your faces for just a moment. So I'm going to stop sharing just so I can see you. Okay, so tell me some things about what might be happening. This was the best educated generation. More people in this generation have gone to 2- and 4-year colleges to date. And remember, the oldest of them is 27, so they're still in that first half of their cohort. So tell me a little bit about what's happening with COVID and their education. What can you tell me? You might have a few of these in your home or be working with them. Are they all still going to school, those that started a few years, 2 or 3 years ago? Well,
No, they're going to school at home. There's a loss of socialization.
yes.
They communicate with their teachers through this thing.
Mhm.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Bonnie. So if you were listening to NPR maybe last week or the week before, a new study was introduced to us that 1 million less students we have in college in 2- and 4-year colleges this year than in 2019. If you look at the percentages, that means there are about 13% less students in school than 2 years ago. Now, being an educator, I knew, and universities and colleges across, this would be the United States now, would know that we are all gearing up for 2026. Why? Because for some reason, the birth rate dropped off.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So, Holly, you're absolutely right. So we were trying to get ready for that. And then
I'm sorry,
about,
what did Holly say?
go ahead.
It's called the birth dearth.
The birth dearth. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, I thought she was asking a question, but she wasn't, so I'm gonna let her say it.
no, I truly was. Sorry. Thank you, Holly. So the birth rate, it's called birth dearth, dropped. So if you've been in the academy, you've been preparing for what are we going to do? How are we going to keep our university going, especially if we're tuition and residentially driven? If we really need those dorms filled and we really need tuition. For well endowed, it doesn't affect us. But for that small Christian liberal arts college, those 100 schools and consortium, as well as many of our city colleges, it truly impacts us. But it happened 6 years ahead of schedule. All of a sudden, our dorms are empty, or for students who did return, there may only be 30%, like the university I taught at, have come back. So they are, that dollar in their hand is very tempting when tuition rates are so high, when inflation is now so high because of COVID. So the question really is, will they come back? Now, I'm not going to stay there, but I just kind of wanted to give you a little information because many, even of the students that you might have seen attending your churches, may not all be back in school. So many of them are waiting it out, kind of a wait and see mentality. All right, so I want to get back to screen sharing, move on a little bit further. There we go. And I also want to get back to, whoops. Here we go. Thank you for your patience. Are we still in the slideshow mode? Are you seeing the big screen that I'm showing you right now? Or the PowerPoint?
Yes, we are. Mhm.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Yes, yep.
Great. And then there's more things I could say, but they are much less likely to ascribe to gender binaries. Over 50% of them think gender is fluid. Whoops, I had a little spelling mistake there. Forgive me. So let's talk a little bit about the characteristics that are kind of pressuring Gen Z. So I told you what I was raised in. Gen Z has been raised in a time of conflict, a lot of violence, injustice, political turmoil, and it's been very chaotic and confusing for them. Just think about this. 2 years ago, even a year and a half ago in the summer, Anglos lined up on the streets, raised their fists in solidarity with the Black community, weekend after weekend after weekend. And yet, a year and a half later, we have a good almost half of our states now, at least 20 of them have passed restrictions on voting so that our essential workers and our people of color cannot get to the polls as easily. Now, please I don't want to lose you and have you think I'm talking about politics. I'm not doing that right now. What I'm saying is we are in a very chaotic and confusing time for young people. I'm just giving you one example. They grew up in a financial recession, on an unemployment roller coaster. They've observed their family members, their aunts and uncles, sometimes grandparents and their own parents have been employed and then unemployed. Tuition rates, as I said, have increased, so they're facing some educational barriers. What do they want? They want an education that will be useful and really relevant for a good job. Survey after survey in the research tells us that. Their preparation for the future is paramount to them right now. But also they don't plan on taking a back seat to the issues that address the world. Another research and another James Chung, who works with generational theory, who also has worked his entire life in campus ministry, reports that Gen Z that InterVarsity Christian Fellowship works with, they say, we want to keep our options open. Don't think that we're overly sensitive, but realize that we're going through a lot. This generation has such high anxiety. I would say in my teaching, the last 3 years, I have never seen the degree of anxiety that college students have than presently. Dropping out because they can't handle the anxiety of the classroom or of the assignments. So much else is going on in their life. They want us to know that they're a whole person and they have a lot to offer, and they want to learn from us. Another study comparing Gen Z with millennials. Gen Z are so realistic. Millennials, very optimistic. Millennials were told, you can be anything you want to be. And they had helicopter parents. Gen Z, independent. Do you know they like to work on their own more than they like to work in a group? And millennials are very collaborative. Gen Z would rather say, just give me my assignment, whether it's at work or educationally, let me get it done. And then I'll come back and I'll report to the group. And then let's work together. But I can retrieve and find that so much more quickly than having to do it with a group of people. They're digital natives versus digital pioneers. Here's something interesting. Gen Z, they like their privacy. Millennials, they've been very out there on social media. They're pretty much telling you what's happening. If you're following them on Twitter, they could tell you what's going on all day long, right? Not Gen Z. They're very selective in what they're telling and who they're telling. That's why they love like Snapchat, right? It disappears in a second. It's going to be gone in 60 seconds, 120 seconds. They're very discretionary. You probably know this, but let's see on Instagram. They've got a community of people. Maybe your youth pastor is one of them. Maybe you're one of them. Maybe as a parent, you're in that group. But many of them have an inner group and have for years, where it's much more private, where they're really sharing what they think and who they are. And I also want to add that in survey after survey, recent surveys of Generation Z, they are longing and crave face-to-face. Where millennials really happy to work at home, digital only, not Gen Z. They are lonely and they want to work with us of other generations face-to-face. Now, how are they shaping the church? So millennials often, they're just deconstructing white supremacy. They're growing like crazy interculturally. They're decolonizing the gospel, and we need all that work done. But what often happens for millennials is they get stuck. What is to construct in its place? They don't have guides helping them. And the struggle, they're just in a struggle, often losing the good news. Like, what's good about the good news? If they're Christians as well, thinking back now, perhaps on the insurrection, they're experiencing one or the other. Either a lot of shame, how could Christians be involved in this? This is Christian nationalism. This isn't Christianity. Or if they're in a different camp as Christians, they're feeling a lot of anger, they're feeling isolated, they're feeling blamed, and they're feeling misrepresented. Gen Zs often tend to, or excuse me, millennials often tend to be more judgmental of Gen Zs. This is from people who work with them. Okay, so a little bit more. This is from my own research now. How are Gen Zs shaping the church? They truly want, or excuse me, let me rephrase that. I'm on millennials right now. How are millennials shaping the church? They want to make a difference. They want to contribute to something meaningful. They want to grow. They want to serve. They want to be mentored and invested in. Just think about their TV shows, their reality shows. It's all about mentoring. And they want to give back to their community. But these 6 or these 5 characteristics are aspirational. So we can be thinking, how can the church help them reach their aspirations? And my book will give you lots of ideas about that. Right now, I just want to drop a few pebbles in the pool to get you thinking. That's millennials. How are Gen Z shaping the church? Well, they love access to mentors and experts, and they're really welcoming that input. They want to grow. They like to be coached. They really appreciate you. They even like their parents. You know, they may not want their parents to show up in every single place they're at, but they like their parents. They influence the church by showing up and sharing their stories of real struggles. Now, my husband and I have served in churches from mega churches to church planting, where I can remember the first few weeks, we were 2 of the 3 of us, right? And in mid-sized churches, all kinds. In the last 6 months, we're in a much smaller church than we've ever been before. I would say there were probably 60 voting units that voted us in last summer when we candidated here. So we're a fairly small church, especially when it comes to the pandemic. Now, we've heard numbers like we were 500, we were 200, but right now, Mark and I are really happy if we have 100, 120 people showing up and another 50 people online. I'm guessing our church size, up and down, reflects a lot of where you guys are, possibly where we are today. But you know what's happening? We're near a university, and we've been having 40 and 50 students show up. They're just showing up, Gen Z, at church. So they also, as I mentioned, they are lonely. When you Google Gen Z, you're going to find it's going to talk about the lonely generation. I had a student say to me last year in my Gospel of John class, after the beginning of the class, he declared himself an atheist, and I teach at a university that welcomes all faiths, but everybody has to take Intro to the Bible, and everyone has to take one other Bible course. And this student said to me, I'm an atheist. I don't believe all that stuff. My dad's a pastor. I've been there, done that, and I'm not doing it anymore. By the end of the semester, he wrote to me and said, Dr. Seves, I would come to anything anyone invites me to. He's such an example of what Gen Z are like going through the pandemic, but they also give us hope. Those working with them, they say, we are so excited about Gen Z. So what I want to do now, I'm going to put my screen down, but this is just a large group discussion. In a little bit, we're going to go into some small group discussions, but just for 5 minutes now. And I'm going to ask, Tim, will you make sure we don't go over 5 minutes, please? What generational cohort do you belong to? What are some of the things that shaped your generation? We won't be able to hear from all 14 of you or 15 of you, but a few of you, I'd love for you to share. In what ways did these events, movements you went through, how did they shape you in your generation? And since I'm a boomer and I've already talked, I'd love to hear from another generational person. So let me stop sharing for a minute and let's hear from a few of you. And probably have time for 3. So if you keep your comments to about a minute or so, it'd be great. Thank you. I'm going to pick on someone. Let's see. Janine. So I don't know your age. It's really hard to tell, but what generation are you?
So I'm right on the cusp of Gen X and millennial.
I love it.
I was born in 1980.
Yes.
It's interesting because as I was trying to think of the things that I remember growing up, as far as wars, I remember Desert Storm. I remember my dad staying up and watching the news all night, every night when we went through that. I remember some young adults from our church serving there. But what I don't know if it's interesting. What I'm thinking though is a big defining thing for my generation, I think, was music movements.
Yes.
We grew up with MTV. I was in middle school when Kurt Cobain died.
Mhm.
You know, and there's the rise of hip hop and rap and culture. And I really feel like that shaped us a lot. And we were just the beginning of technology. I remember when we got a computer. I remember when we got email, and I remember playing Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy as the first computer game.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Okay, let's hear from someone else. I love that you identified you were a cusper. I can't tell. Let's see. Let me just pick on Will for a minute. Hey, Will, if you'll unmute. Oh, maybe, Will, are you there? Can you unmute? He might have stepped away. I actually thought I was looking at your picture, Will. Okay, forgive me. Let's see.
I'm happy to go if that's
Thank you. Yes.
okay.
I would,
I am not a millennial. I am a Gen X,
yes.
kind of in the middle of Gen X, but my husband and I often say that we both grew up kind of in families that were way more boomer oriented. So unlike a lot of my friends, I had a pretty solid family background, whereas a lot of my friends, you know, parents were going through divorces, or the traditional Christian family was starting to look different for my generation, I think. And that's one thing that I remember and note about my growing up in
Yeah.
Gen X. So
Thank you. Excellent. Tim, do we have time for one more? Or no, you tell us.
Yeah, you're good. You can do one more.
One more. Could someone just jump in, please? It would really help me. It doesn't matter where you are, just share a little bit. Doesn't matter what generation you are.
I think, so I too am on the cusp. I was born in 79. And so I wouldn't identify as a millennialist. And I think it is fascinating to me. I remember laying on my parents' couch. I had come home to visit. I live in Boston, Michigan. I came home to visit them, and a commercial came on, and it was email is going to be on your phone. And I just remember like my jaw literally dropping open. I just was like, well, that is a great idea. I also think it's interesting. I don't want to take us off of like this topic, but some of my friends are in their 20s, like 25, 26, 28. And I have heard, and based on some of the things you've identified, this seems like it would be true, that 28 to 30-year-olds find more in common, who are either married with no children or single, find more in common with 65-year-olds who are empty nesters than 32-year-olds because of their value system of privacy. And I just thought that was interesting. I don't know if you want to pin that for later, but
yeah, we might get there later. Thank you for bringing that to our attention. So I just want to thank you all for contributing. It's so fascinating, generational theory, and hearing each other's stories just a little bit too. So I'm going to move on a little bit so that you have some breakout time together in our next set of questions after I give a little bit more information. So, okay, let's go back to sharing the screen and back to the PowerPoint. Let's see, cancel that. I think I pushed leave the meeting instead of sharing my screen. That would have been a problem. Okay, great. Thank you. So the next little bit of information I want to share is, this is from, if you haven't seen it, the Connected Generation, and a newer study in the last few years. It's a global study of 18 to 35-year-olds. So they're not now they're not saying this is Gen Z, this is millennial. This is saying everybody between 18 and 35. Globally, we interviewed, and I would just encourage you to look at, just order it on Amazon or something, because it's going to show you almost country by country, which is very cool. But the broad swaths of findings were Gen Z is so globally minded, very quick to embrace causes they believe in. They are driven by a sense of humanitarian responsibility. So important to think about that as a church. They are personally invested in what's happening beyond their communities, and they're very open to authentic connection, just like millennials. They want it real, they want it authentic. And Christians among this group, because this is not just a study that Barna did only of Christians, it's non-Christians as well, have a passion to live out Jesus's calling in Matthew 25. They want, these young people want to care for the hungry, the stranger, the marginalized, those who are sick and in need, imprisoned, all of that. So what are the challenges that the Connected Generation study identified among really half of these folks are millennials and half are Gen Z? These would be the younger millennials. They're dissatisfied with the church, the Christians. They long for congregations that will do more to fight injustice. And they long for churches that are going to make a significant impact on poverty. They want their church to help in this way. So I talked about this idea that came out of the Connected Generation study. How has growing up in a very chaotic and contradicting world left them? I mentioned that high anxiety, especially around finances. They are very focused on financial stability, a job, getting housing, providing for themselves, paying up their debt. Millennials can feel like they got a raw deal, right? With this high inflation and then low paying jobs, and boomers not moving over. And then even greater anxiety between 18 to 35-year-olds when they feel like they're all on their own under this stress. They took on the debt. They have to find housing where there's nowhere to find housing. And so connecting to friends and the faith community on this research, on these surveys, lowered their anxiety. But the challenge was to get them in the door of church, right? And we're going to get to that when we get to my book. So what are some strategies for working with Gen Z and millennials? We talked a little bit about this slide. I think this is a repeat, so I'm going to move on here. Making time for face-to-face. They absolutely crave that. So how can we in the church make time for them face-to-face? Eating outside, taking them to coffee, connecting for lunch outside. Transparency. They are very realistic problem solvers. Gen Z does not want to be protected from problems or have you sugarcoat them. They've been on this roller coaster financially with their families. They want to be a part of a solution. They desire to be consulted in decision-making. They really value parent input in decisions, far more than millennials. Their parents are their primary role models. They involve their parents in many of their decisions, very unlike millennials. And so keep that in mind and empower them to be part of making good solutions. So here's a little bit more of strategy I want to share with you from Doug Schaub. Doug has written 3 excellent books. I Once Was Lost, What Postmoderns Tell Us About Their Journey to Faith in Jesus, Breaking the Huddle for Churches. So anyway, here's just 3 slides I got from Doug that I think was really helpful in working with millennials and Gen Z. When do they feel empowered? We feel empowered when we're invited into a brainstorm where you values our ideas, like a brain dump. That's millennials. Invite us in, ask us what we think. Let me give you an example. So if you're trying to solve the problem, like people visit your church, but they don't come back. It's like they seem to show up once or twice and they're gone. Boy, you give that problem to millennials and they're going to start brainstorming with you on how to solve it. Gen Z, we feel empowered when you show us how to be successful. When you ask us, how do you want to do outreach? It sounds like you don't know how to do your job. Let's develop that a little bit more. Courage, millennials, I feel courageous when you believe in me. I want you to give me freedom to use my hunches and my intuition. Millennials are so good at figuring things out on their own. Gen Z, I feel courageous when I can take clear steps down a path towards success. My felt need is for you to play the role of the expert and help me learn to do what you do, right? So If I'm going to be an intern, tell me how many hours I'm going to be here. Tell me exactly what you want me to do. Coach me, mentor me, be the expert. Show me how to do it. I want to learn from you. When do we feel overwhelmed? Well, millennials, when I'm overwhelmed, what do? I share my concerns with you, and might be a little bit raw and just kind of put it all out there. I'm thinking of a 30-year-old yesterday on a church staff, associate pastor, and it's kind of just where she went. What happens with Gen Z when I'm overwhelmed? What do I think? I think you're less trustworthy, and I want to avoid the conflict. And I may even ghost you. Like, youth pastors are constantly having trouble connecting with young people. Why? Because they don't respond to their texts. Sometimes they won't let them in on Instagram. How do I connect with you? They're certainly not going to answer an email, right? So that avoiding conflict. Okay, let's talk a little bit about sharing your faith and what that looks like for Gen Z. Now, this is going to be suggestive. This research is very, very new. Alpha and Barna linked together in Canada. So that's why I'm saying it's suggestive. It's coming out of Canada. And what they're finding is a difference in terminology and method when it comes to sharing your faith with this generation. Just like millennials, there's an allergic reaction to the E word, evangelism, right? Some of us sitting right here might not like the word evangelism because it evokes some past strategies that we have found no longer helpful. And yet for some of us, I always say when I'm teaching evangelism, whatever age, whether it's pastors or to students, if that is working for you, whatever you're doing, keep it up. If you find it's not working, you might consider, instead of leading with word, leading with deed and following that up with word and explanation for why we're doing things that way. But yet a number, this was so fascinating on this survey that the Canadians did. They asked these Gen Z, tell us what's the number one feeling you have when you share your faith? It was calm. Crazy, right? This generation believes in being true to who they are. So telling their friends what they believe in is very natural to who they are. Their idea of sharing their faith doesn't look like what it does to previous generations, but they are so willing to tell people, hey, I go to church, I follow Jesus, or here's my rhythms of what that of a life following Jesus is like. But they're not as keyed in on what it means to have someone come to share that same belief. Like they could use some training and learning on how does that happen? What does it look like to invite someone else into faith? So again, this is research coming out of Canada, but I thought it was so informative. There's a difference also in method and approach and message when it comes to Gen Z. There's a reaction, and I also saw this among millennials, kind of a rejection against a solely salvation for heaven message, being a limited message. When I've done millennial research and over again, I would find people were like, I'm not interested in going to heaven. I don't need a ticket to heaven. That just didn't communicate the good old Kennedy questions from the past, right? Coming out of a Presbyterian background, you know, if you die today or tonight, would you go to heaven? Well, that's not very interesting to younger generational people, but there are things about the gospel that are interesting. So thinking about that, it's not the whole story, it's a limited message. And so often they don't even want to hear saved language, right? So it doesn't mean that we deny the gospel when we use other terms to describe the gospel. So there's a dissonance with this generation with a proclamation approach as well. When you invite your friends to come hear a speaker or a band that's going to tell your friends how to become Christians. Now, hear me out again. If that's working for you or your church, continue. Because culture doesn't just stop and end and a new culture starts. No, there's a layering of culture upon culture. So there are things that will work with people from the past, as well as sometimes that's not working. We need to contextualize our sharing to this new generation. So this is interesting. And I'm going to ask Tim, I need a drink of water. I'm getting a little dry. I would love to mute for a second while you read this slide. And Shayla is with Alpha Canada. And I love what she had to say here. I thought it was really helpful.
Yeah, be happy to read that.
Thank you.
Shayla Visser, Alpha Canada says, that isn't language we use at Alpha. We want people to come into a relationship with Jesus and realize there is a good life in following a good Jesus here and now. Jesus helps us to think about how we care for creation. He helps us to think about how we care for the poor, how we look after our neighbor. That this isn't just about the end of your life, although important, but how you live every day. Gen Z needs to learn how to frame the gospel in a holistic nature that includes Jesus came to save you for here and now, not just eternity. Jesus is not just true, but he is good.
Thank you. And the next one, Tim, and then I'll pick up.
Okay. This is Tim, Alpha Canada. One thing we can consider is because Gen Z is so concerned about caring for the environment, social justice, caring for the oppressed and the marginalized, we need to let them know Jesus was one of the very first champions to introduce social change. His methodology is in Luke 4, to bind up the brokenhearted, to set the captives free, to declare this is the year of the Lord's favor, and to invite students to consider or see that their passions and desires are evangelistic in nature. Our desire to see the kingdom of heaven on earth can be aligned under a gospel fluency. Instead of creating a false dichotomy for students that says there is of social work and evangelism. But what is an integrated approach to use your hands and your heart is to proclaim the gospel with your words and with your actions. This is a congruent, integrated gospel that involves your entire being.
Thank you so much, Tim. Now, we're going to talk about that in just a moment. There's one more term I want to define for us, and that is, it's on the title of my book. It's a lot of places. What is emerging adulthood? So emerging adults are aged 18 to 29. So right now that would include those last few millennials and the first Gen Z. It comes out of the human development literature. It's a developmental life stage that's extended between adolescence and adulthood. And there are generally 5 characteristics that you'll find when you're reading about this life stage among 18 to 29-year-olds. There's a lot of instability, transition and in-betweenness. For example, you'll meet a young adult, they're living at home, somewhere between the ages of 18 and 29 and working as a barista. However, they started at a state college and it just didn't work out for them. They were either partying, they ran out of money, something happened at home, my mom got sick, whatever, they came home. Now they've got a job, don't really love working at home, but they're saving up and they're hoping in a semester or two to go back to junior college. There's a time of self-focus, and that makes sense, right? They are learning to stand on their own. This period of 10 years, they're increasing independence from their family and other support structures. A lot of change happening for them, but they're also out there exploring the possibilities. They tend to be optimistic, and I'm going to come back right now to this next slide about identity exploration. 18 to 29-year-olds are exploring their identities. So that identity what is identity? Well, it's the search for myself. And how do I relate to the wider context? What do I mean by I'm searching for myself? Well, I'm answering these questions, particularly in my 20s. Who am I? What am I going to do with my life? What groups am I going to commit to? Who's going to be my life partner? How will I contribute to the world? Like, where's my part in this big world? And what are my goals, my values, beliefs, my group memberships, and my roles? I want to just give you an example. So here I'm interviewing a woman at a festival called Burning Man. She says, and this, I'm just quoting her word for word. I entered college as a statistics major. I graduated with an accounting degree. I went to work for a Big Four. I hated it. I was miserable. So I got a new job. My boyfriend and I, we dated 4 years. And then we broke up for 3.5 years. And we just started dating again. I left accounting and I went into recruiting. But now actually I recruit for a startup in San Francisco. So we see that instability there, right? A lot of transitioning happening. This woman has gone through different partners, and she's also going through different economic situations, different jobs. So let's talk for just a second. What are those traditional markers for achieving adulthood? And this is throughout generations. It's basically been leaving home, finishing my education, whether it was high school, a trade school, an internship, an apprenticeship, 4-year college. It's also financial independence, marriage and family formation. And it used to be home ownership, but now that's not always possible for young adults. So it's just having a rental or some independent living situation than with my parents. That would not apply to all cultures. Latino youth, we call them youth until they get married. And they generally live at home until they're married because it's out of respect for the family. The family would be shamed for the Latina community if their young adults are not living at home, often in a traditional family. So what's extending this life stage? Like a lot of times you'll hear older people say, what's wrong with these young adults? We figured it out. What's taking them so long, right? Well, it's the economy that's driving this. Also, specialized job training or more education is required. You see so many more people going back for a second degree or to grad school, or they have to go to coding school for a year in order to keep up and in order to be attractive for companies to hire them. Boomers have been slow, like me, so slow to retire. Automation and artificial intelligence is replacing swaths of people. And there have been huge hiring freezes in the last 10 years. It's not that easy to be a young adult as it was for previous generations. Just one example of delayed identity commitments, emerging adults, because the economy is as shaky as it is, and they're not able to get those stable jobs, they are marrying so much later. Look in the 1960s. Most women were out of high school for 2 years when they got married. Most men, 4 years. What about 2020? Women were 28, the average getting married. That means many more were older as well as younger. And most men were almost age 31. I'm just going to briefly show you this graph. Look, 50s, 60s, 70s. You get up here to 2000. And they're older now. They're getting close to 24. But what's happened in the last 20 years? Whoa, much closer to 30 when I'm getting married. That means I'm having children even later. Excuse me? Yes.
No, please continue.
Oh, that's right, Bonnie. Thank you. So let's pause a moment and think about that. What are the traditional markers for when people go back to church, right? Well, if people drop out, it's usually, don't worry about it, social sciences tell us. They'll come back when they get married and have kids. Well, that was great when they got married at age 20 or 22, right? And we're having children in their maybe mid-20s. But what's happening when they're out of church for 10, 12 years or more? So one thing I want to mention is a theory. It's not only my theory, but I wrote about this, is that I really believe, and not much people are linking these yet, but that the delayed identity commitments, trying to get that job, my life partner, where we're going to live, that's delaying my religious identity commitment. Oh gosh, I forgot to put Tim's last name down here, but he wrote a great book. It's a little bit older, called First Year Out. And he examined first-year college students, or a lot of first-year people, whether they went to college or not. And he said, it seems like they put a lot of their identity, including their religious identity, in a security box, lockbox like at the bank, right? Where you might keep all your papers. Not to get rid of that religious identity, but to come back to it once I figured out how to manage my life. And I think that applies to those religious identity commitments of young adults. They don't really intend, you'll see on surveys of young adults who dropped out of church, they'll say, I never really intended to do that, but that's what happened. So there's this big debate. Are young adults going to come back to church when they eventually or finally settle down, marry, and start families? When they've been out of church for 5, 10, or 15 years, they have new habits, new friendships, new ways of doing things. Are they going to come back? For time's sake, I'm going to put you, just kind of flip through that slide. It pretty much says the same thing. I'd like you now to go into your breakout rooms. And I'm looking at the time, and could we just shorten this to 5 minutes, Tim? And
Bonnie can
thank you.
shorten it to 5 minutes, and I will send you to breakout rooms.
Excuse me for talking to the wrong person.
That's
And-
okay. I will stop the recording first because there's no need to record the breakout
And
sessions.
while you're doing that, I'll just mention the questions you're looking at. What are you learning about Gen Z and young adults? What's it important to think about when you're ministering to them? And do you know a young adult who dropped out of church? You might not get to that question, but they went missing in action. And why do you think that's so? I look forward to seeing you in about 5 or 6 minutes.